Karibu sana, as the Swahilians would say. Welcome, welcome, and welcome again. I am Kiki Edozie. I am the chair of the African Scholars Forum, hosting today's event at UMass Boston's McCormick School for Policy and Global Studies. I'm also currently serving as the school's interim dean. Our annual welcome event at the Africa Scholars Forum and our business meeting is especially special today. Special because our event last year was held fully virtually. And in previous years, we were fully in person. But this year, today, we are holding the event as a hybrid event. We're partially in person. We have about 10 or 15 people in the room here at the University Hall at UMass Boston. And we have about 35 people remotely in Zoom world joining us. So bear with us as we adjust to a twofold presentation. This is the first time ever that we have done that. But this fact recognizes a more serious note. It's our in-between status in attempting to transcend COVID-19 locally and globally. Did you get me there? We are attempting to transcend all of us, COVID-19 locally and globally. And this reminds us that we are not there yet. I am compelled to wear a mask while speaking, but I am told that since I am socially distant enough, I can take it off so that you can hear me. In Africa too, while the continent represents 18% of the global population, guess what? It's only about 2% fully vaccinated in Africa. Well, today we want to venture into a discussion about this and other pressing critical topics of African affairs. To do so, we have invited the continent's leading research center, CODESRIA. The abbreviation stands for the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. Were you okay? Okay, great. Once again, we are adjusting to a hybrid, high-flex moment, and I think our tech person is doing an excellent job for us. This is probably the first high-flex event on campus, ever. So bear with us. Well, we've invited, a leading research center in Africa. The beauty of doing it this way is that we are reaching out all the way to Dakar, Senegal, to the CODESRIA, Council of Development of Social Science Research in Africa. And our welcome keynote speaker is the CODESRIA's Executive Secretary, Dr. Godwin Murunga. We are honored that Dr. Murunga will address us today. You can spotlight him now. Dr. Murunga is a historian and a political analyst of Kenyan origin. Prior to joining CODESRIA as the executive secretary, he was lecturing at the Institute of Development Studies of the University of Nairobi. He was the immediate past director of the African Leadership Center in Nairobi, and he was also at the same time a member of the executive committee of CODESRIA for 2 consecutive terms from 2005 to 2011. Since 2017, Dr. Murunga brings to Codestria many years of robust scholarship, as evidenced by the incisive analysis that characterize his numerous scholarly publications, including Kenya, the struggle for a new constitutional order, and more recently, the forthcoming Africa and the crisis of globalization. Dr. Murunga has also a valuable teaching and management experience and a deep knowledge of the higher educational landscape in Africa. We are told that in appointing him to the high office of Codestria as executive secretary, the executive committee considered Dr. Murunga uniquely qualified for the position, given his track record of robust scholarship and exemplary leadership, and his strong and clear vision for Codestria's future. His talk today is titled Decolonizing African Education, its role in transforming the continent. After Dr. Murunga speaks, he will join us at UMass Boston's Africa Scholars Forum business meeting for about a 15-minute, 20-minute discussion on how we might collaborate with Codestria around Africa's futures. Please join me in giving a huge and handsome welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Murunga.
Thank you very much, Professor Kiki Edozie, for the introduction. Just to confirm that colleagues online can hear me. In the event you can't hear me, let me know. You can hear me.
Could you start again, just like me? Start again, because we missed a bit of you. Thank you so much, Dr. Murunga. Start again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kiki Edozie, for the introduction. And just to confirm that colleagues online can hear me. If you can't hear me, please do let me know. But I'm really grateful to the African Scholars Forum at UMass Boston for the invitation to join into this discussion this evening, speaking from Dakar time. It's roughly 6:20 p.m. in the evening. And I'm happy to join this team and really grateful that one of my former young colleagues, friend and student whom I had the pleasure of supervising at King's College London, Dennis Juko, facilitated this introduction. It is always a good thing, to have this opportunity. My apologies because I have tweaked the topic just a little bit so that it speaks directly to some of the concerns that as a researcher I've had over a period of time. So it's not totally different from what I was asked to speak to. I feel like it was more appropriate to speak to the transformation agenda in higher education in Africa. And so I'm going to speak to that very topic, and I must flag out for a start that part of the inspiration for speaking to this topic is derived from a paper that one of my friends, colleagues, and mentors, Professor Tadea Kinaina, published in the African Studies Review, volume 53, number 1 of 2010, published an article called Beyond Reforms, the Politics of Higher Education Transformation in Africa. This was the Basharon Abiola lecture of the African Studies Association. And in this lecture, Professor Aina made a powerful argument away from a reform agenda in African higher education to a transformation agenda in African higher education. And the argument he advanced there is useful to what we are talking about, because I feel that the transition from decolonization to decoloniality is a transition that has not happened primarily because the African higher education scene and the African education system is actually being held back by a focus on reform rather than on transformation. And the argument I would like to make that while decoloniality as an end result of the transformation process is important, without a clear transformation agenda, it is almost impossible. It's almost impossible to attain the transformation we aspire to have for the African continent. So the assumption sitting behind the topic of this lecture, I would say, is sound. It is sound partly because it certainly makes the assumption that there is an aspiration for decoloniality, and that aspiration is central to continental transformation in Africa. So the question then remains, why haven't we achieved this end result? And I think that missing in the very architecture of this aspiration is the logic of decoloniality, which is different from the logic of decolonization, because decoloniality engenders both an emancipatory and also a transformatory logic. The reason we talk about decoloniality today, and we will have noticed that this has been a major issue of debate across the African continent, and indeed, if you will, in the African and Pan-African world across, the Pan-African scene across the world. It is because there is a correct assumption that the transformation from decolonization to decoloniality did in fact abort at some point, that the agenda for decolonization aborted before it achieved its central objective of completely overhauling the basis upon which colonialism, the basis upon which systems of Western modernity were built and exported into the African continent. There are many reasons why this abortion did happen. There are many reasons why the complete overhaul of the basis upon which colonialism and Western modernity was not formally fully transformed. But two, I think, are important to us. One rests in the agency of decolonization. What is it that we sought to achieve in the process of decolonizing Africa from formal colonial structures? There seems to me that the agents of transforming Africa from a colonial system into a post-colonial system either misunderstood the agenda or in other cases simply capitulated to the logic of neo-colonialism, which is the reason why Frantz Fanon eventually was speaking about Africa enjoying flag independence, but hardly really having substantive transformation away from the colonial logic. Or alternatively, one can make the argument, and it's still a valid argument, that the mechanisms of colonialism, having transformed themselves into a neo-colonial system, retain the capacity to control a large chunk of many of the systems that would have enabled us to move from decolonization to decoloniality. Thinking about this in the 1960s, 1970s, actually 1960s, Kwame Nkrumah makes a very strong argument in his book, actually in two of his books, the first one being the book on Africa Must Unite, and secondly, the book on neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. He makes the argument around colonialism transforming itself into a neo-colonial system and therefore capturing the very logic that would have enabled that transformation from decolonization to decoloniality. And Nkrumah makes the point, I think, in a very powerful way, that the system of education that remained on the continent in itself was a remnant of the very colonial system that was being eradicated. So in this sense, therefore, that transformation that aborted remains captured in a system that we have not been able to systematically dismantle and systematically help facilitate a major transition. Now, to understand the difficulty of transforming colonialism via an emancipatory project into a decolonized system that is able to enhance continental transformation, I think the focus on the education sector is, I think, extremely important, partly because one has to understand the nature of the education system on the continent since the colonial times, and one has to understand what, if at all there were any transformations that took place from the colonial education system into the post-colonial era. And the central argument that has persisted in the literature is one that has essentially made the argument that the basis of colonial education was alienation. And there is a huge debate about whether this is positive or negative. In large measure, any assessment of the colonial education system that has persisted in Africa is one that has suggested that alienation simply removed the humanity of Africans and replaced them with Western modernity, and therefore a different humanity, indeed an othered humanity if you think about it. I cannot think about too many African scholars who have made an argument in favor of alienation, except the Nigerian academic Irele Abiola, who actually wrote an essay titled "In Praise of Alienation," and basically said that if Africa wanted to develop, then embracing alienation, meaning embracing Western modernity, embracing that thing that colonial education introduced into Africa, would itself be a good thing. And the essay was very controversial on many, many levels. In a sense, therefore, one gets the sense that the basis of colonialism, alienation, has been a central problem in transforming African higher education in favor of enhancing what we call continental transformation. Looking at the institutions that have been relevant to knowledge production in Africa, if you will, centering on the school, and there is a long history about the struggle for the school, or in fact centering on the church, mostly the Christian church, but in many cases there are alternative systems of religion that have facilitated the education process. The general conclusion that one comes up to is that these systems have in many senses undermined the possibilities of a transformation of the continent, basically because a lot of what is advanced through their systems of education is, if you will, designed to look outward rather than to look inward. And the challenge of indigenous systems of knowledge, indigenous systems of education, therefore, is because it's confronted by a whole range of institutions on the continent that make it very difficult for this focus to make sense. And the omnipresence and the omnipotence of these institutions that facilitate extraversion, if you will, is perhaps one of the central things that has to be dealt with if actual transformation as an agenda of the African continent driven by education has to advance. A lot of the issues that make a reference point in education in Africa, both from colonial times into the present, have as their reference points not markers within African history, within African cultural systems, but have as their markers largely within European reference points. So if you think about the reference point for time, for a very long time, the reference point for time was the Greenwich meridian time. Ask yourself, which is this Greenwich, and you find that it's a totally different system of cartography and time that is best, that we make reference to. The same thing about geography and space. I think the critique that the late Edward Said makes in relation to cartography as an orientalizing tool is a critique that remains valid, and which is a reference point for a system of education that doesn't respond very adequately to interests, to relevance, in relevance to African reference points. So that if you ask yourself the question, at the point of instituting a transformation away from a system of education that was extroverted, that was looking outward most of the time, into a system of education that would advance continental transformation at whatever point you want. The first instance where Africa misses its opportunity is in the transition from colonialism into independence. Africa misses that particular opportunity partly because the focus of education is not thoroughly overhauled in order to allow for a mission and a vision that advances systems of thought that are relevant to the diversity of the continent and its Pan-African world. On the contrary, across the continent, in the putative year of 1960, all the way into the 1990s and beyond, the focus initially is on an education system that is designed to Africanize the workforce, literally churning out people out of the education system with the focus on Africanization. And so there is Africanization all over. There is an adoption of a whole range of strategies to make sure that the workforce is thoroughly Africanized. Beyond that, one does not see any major leap beyond transformation of the workforce. And the system of education therefore struggles largely and actually delicately to find its place. First, in the national system of the national political economy, if you will, but also it struggles to even have its space beyond the boundaries of the national system. And perhaps the first trap of rethinking education that we failed to overcome was this focus on Africanizing the workforce. Important as it was, I think the next most important step that I think missed an opportunity was to think about our education system and its role in transformation beyond the narrow nation-state framework. That as Africa is becoming independent and every country is thinking about where to go with its education system, the focus is more on the narrow nationalistic spaces than on the broader continental space. And some of the countries that one notes in Africa, given the cartography that went into generating nation states in Africa, hardly made any logic to exist as independent African countries, except for the fact that they had been created under a colonial system. So the statist system that Africa adopts in the 1960s and has continued to defend all the while, indeed is responsible for fragmenting what otherwise would be an initiative that needs to go beyond the continent. And at the end of the day, the transformation that we desire, which is designed to be a continental project, more often than not is fragmented along these narrow nationalistic lines, with the Francophone countries, if you will, focusing for their inspiration back in France, Lusophone ones focusing back in Portugal, and a whole range of all these things have constituted a confusion that we have been unable to completely deal with and unbundle, which makes it difficult to think even in terms of the extent to which education can be a facilitator of transformation at the continental level. And of course, there were initiatives that were mounted by a few African countries designed to totally change the education system and to aspire for something that would speak directly to the situation in those countries. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere's undertaking in rethinking education in Tanzania is a fine example. His study on education for self-reliance sent us two of the most important elements that you need for transformation. One of them being education itself, located within institutions of community that are able to distill that system for purposes of serving communities that have specific needs, but also self-reliance, which is an important ingredient for any form of development. Because there is no country that I can think of, there is no community that I can think of that has developed on the basis of begging from others. Communities that want to develop think about the extent to which they can draw from their own resources. They can ensure that education serves a goal for self-reliance rather than a goal that is simply outward looking. And of course, at the end of the day, when you assess in terms of the philosophy of education, in terms of the content of the curriculum, pedagogy, if you are looking at the language of instruction, the situation does not give you hope that the possibilities of transformation are embedded in the system of education and in the system, in the reformed system of education that we do have even up to today. I always, when I'm talking about this, I'm always thinking about the late Okot Bipitek, the Ugandan poet, anthropologist and critic, who in his voice of, in his book, Song of Lawino, mounts a rather radical ridicule of the system of education that Africans have adopted, using the voice of Lawino, who was depicted in the poems he wrote as an uneducated, in terms of Western education, woman simply observing her sight and wondering why her husband is behaving in such a strange way, a way that does not conform to the actually way of life in Uganda. Okot Bipitek, I think, was onto something when he wrote both Song of Lawino and Song of Akol, itself a radical ridicule of the system of education that I think we have adopted over time. Fast forward into the more modern, more contemporary era, the transformation in our systems of education have been driven by initiatives not local to our communities, not local to our education institutions, not driven by the priorities of governments on the continent, but actually driven by a rather neoliberal framework, one which at its core is an argument that that the value of education rests with the rate of return on investment. You know, this model that the World Bank did, adopt in the 1990s in the context of the structural adjustment program, essentially also forced education into the rate of return on investment analysis. And the argument was simple, that education had to be treated like any other investment. It was useless to make unless the returns are good. The measurement of returns in this sense was actually modeled around an exclusively market logic, that education is an investment in the market like any other thing that you put in the market. And if the returns are not good, governments have no business investing in this. And of course, the spin-off effects of education, many of which are not measurable on a market logic, are treated as irrelevant in the analysis of education. The result of which is that there has been a justification for underinvestment in education, itself representing a retreat on the gains that had already been made, if at all, even if in a neo-colonial context, the gains that had already been made in setting up the education system as an important precursor to transformation. These were shattered mostly across the continent in the 1990s and in the year 2000 and beyond. And actually, a whole range of institutions of education on the continent are struggling to recover from the shattering that happened with the privatization of education, the emphasis of rates of return on investment, and of course, the importance of profit making as a core element of investment in education. The results of this continue to be evidenced across the continent, with the shattering, not just of institutions of learning and the education system itself, but also with governments being unable to even think correctly in terms of how to deal with the education sector and the myriad of challenges that have continued to do this. The point I would like to make here, therefore, is that if we are going to think about decoloniality, and if we are going to think about continental transformation, I think at the center of this discussion must be a discussion about the extent to which decoloniality requires a disruption of all colonial, neocolonial logics that have undergirded education. And as a counterpoint, a revival or introductions of forms of thought that speak to the diversity of situations on the continent, a good many of which that have been studied, and there is clear typologies of how to deal with some of these things. The necessity to disrupt, driven by a desire to change the logic of how we think about the education sector, is perhaps central to the story that we need to tell. And such an undertaking will need for us to deal with the external control and location of knowledge production about Africa. This is very important because we might sit in Dakar and we might sit in Nairobi and we might have very great ideas about how to transform African education. But at the point when we are thinking about institutions that facilitate and legitimate forms of knowledge that are acceptable for policy making, Africa has ceded a lot of policy space to actors who are not necessarily interested in facilitating this transformation. A lot of the important voices that make great impact on policy in Africa are not necessarily African universities, are not necessarily local institutions. Most of them are funding agencies. Most of them are publishing and dissemination outlets. Most of them are influencers of policy in the consultancy world. A good many of these do not necessarily operate in tune with the specific needs of communities that exist on the continent, the communities for whom education is meant to serve, or for communities like Codesria, where we have a significant cohort of African academics working on the continent and in the African diaspora, who have specific ideas and thoughts about how to restructure the education system, and whose thoughts about doing the transformation of the education system and facilitating the transformation of the continent are easily dismissed on the basis of a whole range of things, because as we all know, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And for a long time, I think African communities of knowledge, epistemic communities, if you will, have not been in position to do this, to control the kind of education system that would advance continental unity. There are existing continental frameworks that are designed to facilitate not just a transformation of education, but also transformation of the continent. The African Union Vision 2063 is one such vision. It has placed a central importance on education. Indeed, Codesria and among other institutions were invited at the first summit on education. And the discussion around Vision 2063 was designed to push an agenda that would make education central to continental transformation in many ways. There are major problems in terms of how the conceptualization around the African Union of the role of education in advancing continental transformation has been thought of. For a start, even the continental mechanisms for transformation of the continent are embedded in a system of thought that gives but very little space for local knowledge, for local producers of knowledge, but also there is no space to rethink education across the board from the primary basic level to the tertiary levels. There is a new obsession across the continent, an obsession that you don't see in many other places, which essentially tells Africa and African countries that if you want to develop, the core focus must simply be the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And there is a new emphasis on digital transformation. how you do digital transformation in a continent where the supply of electricity is limited is something that still beats the logic out of many of our villagers across the continent. But also the assumption that development will happen with an emphasis simply on STEM disciplines really flies in the face of the fact that there is no engineering that exists in a vacuum. There is no mathematics that exists in a vacuum. That at the end of the day, the translation of these disciplines into useful purposes of the continent has to be connected to human and social relations. And at the point when you have human and social relations, then you have a major problem. There is a critique that we can mount. And I think the COVID pandemic has taught us quite a bit about this across the world, yes, but here in Africa, perhaps even more importantly. The lesson we have learned here in Africa is very simple. You can train the best doctors at any university in Dakar or in Lome or in Accra or in Nairobi. You can train your best doctors. They can go and work anywhere in the world and they will do wonders. But being connected to the social context within which a pandemic like COVID-19 comes is perhaps even more important in resolving the challenges of an institution. So that this assumption that the hospital is the center around which you treat illnesses has been upset in various ways by how we think about knowledge and all that. I would like to work quickly through a conclusion, and there are a number of things that I would like to put on the table. Essentially, that if we are going to really begin to think about continental transformation, the transformation agenda needs to be reinserted into this argument. And what's important for me is that we have to really be radical in terms of how we rethink education in order for it to facilitate transformation. Professor Tadia Aina, writing on this topic, essentially says that transformation refers to an intentional social, political, and intellectual project of planned change aimed at addressing historical disadvantages, inequities, and serious structural dysfunctions. Projects of transformation challenge assumptions, values, and power relations, and they offer alternative visions and situations. Transformation implies practical and epistemological ruptures with previous ways of doing things and a reconstruction of structures, relations, cultures, and institutions. In the case of the African higher education, transformations entail going beyond reform. It involves a re-examination of inherited institutions and how we think about and live within them, and a reconstruction of these institutions as durable, sustainable structures geared to meet African needs. In this summary definition of transformation, one gets the sense that there is a question of equity, there is a question of relevance, and there is a question, of course, of this relevance being directed towards the very focus around which transformation, continental transformation, is designed to do. Transformation is not about focusing on the managerial. It's not about tinkering with change here and there. This is a process that, transformation is a process that avoids the easy options and goes for the more sophisticated challenges. It cannot be a top-down process, whether top means from the national governments downwards or from external agencies downwards. And of course, it must avoid a situation where we reduce our higher education institutions in particular into vocational institutions, simply serving as conveyor belts of one or two things. The argument that I think I would like to place to the table is that unless we resolve the transformation question, decoloniality cannot occur. And of course, unless we transform this particular dilemma of the tension between reform and transformation, I don't think that continental transformation can be on the agenda. So rethinking education system, both from the basic level to the tertiary level, is important. Introducing capacity building initiatives that help to not just to rethink, but transform the very way in which we think about this. And at the policy level, I think there needs to be an intervention that allows Africans to recapture a level of sovereignty over their own policy decisions. Because for too long, the policy space in Africa has been captured by a whole range of actors, a good many of whom are not interested in creating systems of thinking, policies that advance the argument that I have. And at the end of the day, if the African education system can go back to the role of being the greatest equalizer among people, among communities, among genders, among races, among a whole range of diversities, if the African higher education especially can be that which allows us to equalize opportunities for everyone, then the idea of self-reliance, which, as I hinted in my area advanced, which is central to the continental transformation, which is important for development, would be brought back. And at that point, I believe that we would have advanced in terms of even having the possibility of linking up the various diversities into a continental system of thinking that is ready for transformation. I hope that this raises one or two things that would be useful for discussion, and I would request to stop there at this point. Thank you very much for listening to me and for inviting me.
This is a discussion on transforming the continent, but only anchored on the decolonization agenda of the education system. And so this is a timely discussion that we are having now, and thank you so much for accepting our invite to give us this keynote lecture. And I think we wouldn't have gotten anything more than what you're giving us today. And I note a few things in your lecture, because you discuss an article on Beyond Reform, the Politics of Knowledge Production in Africa, but by Professor Tade Aina. And the participants, or the attendants in the Zoom, in this lecture actually, are asking if they could have a link to the article. And but also you focus the discussion.
Can we stop with that and ask the question about whether or not and get an answer about the link?
Oh.
It is possible to share the link, and it's also possible to share I think it's an open access article, so I can definitely send it to you and the link to you, and then unfortunately, the system right now cannot pick it up, so I won't be able to share it in the chat, but I will provide it to you.
We appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Murunga. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so but also a focus, I think you anchor your discussion or your lecture on the need to focus rather on the missing link, where we focused on reform rather than transforming the continent's education system. And you make a reference to a complete overhaul of the education system in Africa, but also you refer to the architecture of the education aspirations in Africa that misses decoloniality. You refer to Frantz Fanon, who referred to African independence as independences with a flag, but not real independence, but also Nkrumah, that talked about the education, that Africa as a continent that we inherited is a DNA of the colonialism. And this is something that I think the agenda for decolonizing African education is currently confronting. But I wouldn't want to exhaust all the discussion that you've made, but it becomes challenging, especially when someone is moderating a discussion that is this rich from a professor well known, but also a mentor and a former supervisor. And so for me, you know, when we are discussing about this event, for me, my mind ran to you because of the centrality of the work you're doing with Codesria on decolonizing Africa's education. And so for me, my question then is, because my takeaway from the lecture is, you know, that we need to embrace an education system that is, that the education system that we embraced is out of sync with the societies in Africa that it's meant to serve, or even liberate, because we know that education is supposed to be a liberation. And for me, confronting this reality means overhauling the education system, which you, Dr. Godwin, you call transformation, by bringing Africanness back into Africa's education. And I make reference also to Professor Bayo Olukoshi, who said that decolonizing Africa's education means bringing African humanity back into Africa's education system. But I will not make the whole day for my discussion about the lecture, but rather opening the discussion up to other participants who would like to throw in comments, but also ask questions about what you put on table, but also their thoughts. And I think, will it be okay if we can take like 3 questions at once, and then you discuss them, or you respond to them, and then we pick another 3 questions. So in the audience, but also on Zoom, just in case there are some 2 people that would want to give the first question.
Go ahead.
Yes, Vio.
Got one here, and then you take one from Zoom. No Zoom questions. I don't think you gave them the instructions in Zoom about Q&A. Did you give them the instructions that they can? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Violet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murunga, for this very thought-provoking presentation. And it's had me thinking about so many things. And one of them is within the line of decoloniality and transforming our education system on the continent. Given that we're so many countries with diverse languages and cultures, even within specific countries, again, we're very heterogeneous in nature. How do you think this would work out? Do you have any ideas about how we could implement a transformation that would work for at least most people? Because one of the arguments against is that we have competing and conflicting cultures, aspirations, and even objectives. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're looking for a second question.
Yeah.
Do we have a question online? Okay, sir, not yet.
Anyone that would want to give a question?
No.
Okay, so I've got a question. You don't mind? You know, fantastic talk, Dr. Murunga, and wow, you know, if only we could decolonize education in the continent. I mean, do you think that your proposal is idealistic, or do you think that it is achievable? If it is achievable, can you provide some concrete policy action mechanisms that you want every African country to undergo, on the one hand individually, but mostly collectively? You know, what is the role then of the African Union in embarking upon, you know, this huge policy change that you are proposing? Do we have a third question online? Okay, well, we have a second question.
I'd love to ask a question. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. This is Emily Ju.
Yes, we do. We'll take you, Emily, and then we'll have a 4th question with Professor Nada. Okay, Emily, go ahead, Emily.
Yes, thank you for organizing this, and it was a pleasure to listen to you, Dr. Murunga. My question is about the role of the community in this transformation, this internal transformation. I think on the continent, the community plays a very important role in education, yet underestimated or even acknowledged at the policy level. So, and thinking about higher education, especially even from the K-12, there is a disconnect between the school, the university, and the community. And so for me, I think in thinking and being in decoloniality, it is central to engage community. And even for us in the humanities, maybe that is one of the ways to really revitalize the role of the humanities in this transformational process. So I'm just wondering if there are initiatives or something that Cudistria is envisioning along these lines. You know, how does Cudistria engage with the issue of transformation in the education systems, our various education systems, and what are the ways that the council engages the community, and community could be as, you know, micro as the, you know, the neighborhood, but also all the actors, all the stakeholders in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Diouf of Brandeis University. It's great to hear you, Emily.
Nice to meet you.
My former student. Okay, Professor Nada Ali has a question, and then we'll leave it at that for the 4 questions, Dr. Murunga. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murunga. Such an inspiring and really insightful lecture, which I enjoyed. I just want to engage, I think it's really important for us to engage with the concept of decoloniality at a conceptual and the theoretical level as well. And of course, there is a rich body of literature coming out of Latin America, right? Latin American countries and scholars on decoloniality. But also within the African continent, we have the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for example. This week in my Women in African Cultures class, we are discussing decolonizing the mind, for example. How do we bring this kind of work to bear on the kind of analysis that you have advanced in your lecture? Thank you.
Thank you.
And some of my students here, I encourage them to also ask questions if possible.
Thank you. They have been doing a good job. All right, let's get Dr. Murunga to answer this first round of questions. And then if we have time, we'll have some others from the room and through Zoom.
Thank you very much. Maybe let me make a confession that I may have made a very complex problem look as a very easy problem where you can have very clear answers and a magic bullet that brings everything together, and then voila, you have it there. I think the first acknowledgement we have to make is that this is a massive problem. It's such a massive problem that I think there are a whole range of African countries that really don't know what to do in order to reorganize their education sector to serve the purpose first of national development and then of continental transformation. And in many places, we must acknowledge that there is even very little attention being given to education as a sector. I think a few years ago, Mahmoud Mamdani did a book which Codesria published titled Scholars at the Marketplace. And it was an analysis of the experience of Makerere University in the context of the neoliberal transformations that took place there. And what one got out of that book was really the total destruction of the university system, but also the total destruction of the idea of the university. And one can replicate examples of this across the board, which is why perhaps I am gravitating towards the question that Pearl Robinson has asked making reference to Thandika Mkandawire's brilliant lecture on running when others walk. Thandika was actually quoting the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who made the argument that the dilemma of African task for development rested in the fact that they needed to be running while everyone else was leisurely taking a walk on this almost linear journey of development. And there rests the answer to a whole range of things that, of questions that have come. Because at the level of thinking about development, which is what I think the notion of transformation was signaling to, is really the dilemma is that the continent needs to find a framework around which not only it does things to catch up, but also things that are relevant and sustainable to its own being as a continent. And in view of the diversities that have been a point of reference here, in view of the many challenges, the heterogeneity of the continent, it looks like it's almost impossible. But I think we need to come to this question around diversity and heterogeneity with a clear understanding that it's not only Africa that is heterogeneous, and it's not only Africa that is diverse. There is diversity across the board. It may not necessarily be ethnic or whatever, but there is diversity across the board. So I think the task of education is essentially finding a way of thinking through this heterogeneity and diversity and imposing a certain semblance of planning and order that allows society to use its education system for purposes of transformation. And I think I made constant reference to the notion of self-reliance as being central to the thinking around what we do with our education system in order to realize transformation. And for me, what the notion of self-reliance means is that a whole range of different people looking to be self-reliant are using the resources, they are using the capacities that they have within their communities, within their regions, within their countries, in order to tap into an education system that facilitates that transformation. So the idea is not for a uniform system of education that facilitates a uniform transformation of the continent. Rather, it is every diversity thinking about what are the possible pathways towards enhancing development, enhancing transformation that facilitates the communities to have agency about their own transformation. I think it's the task of education to think through the many-sidedness of this challenge and to be able to provide ways in which this catching up has to happen. And it's not going to be uniform across the board in terms of how transformation happens. It's going to vary depending on the capacities that are available. But if the central logic of this development is self-reliance, based on an assumption that the agency of those who want the transformation is factored in, I would say that it is the trick rests there. The trick rests in being able to harness education for purposes of reconciling ourselves to the fact that self-reliance is going to be the central point. Often when I'm talking about this thing, I'm always reminded of communities where they have chosen to measure development not on the basis of GDP, but on the basis of a happiness index. So being able to think about what it is that facilitates communities of people to feel comfortable with the situation they exist in is a lot more important than taking a universal measure of development and imposing it as the central goal for which education has to serve. Being flexible in terms of thinking about this thing, I think is going to be central to how we do this. And, there was a question about decolonizing education and the proposals I made and whether they are achievable or whether they are idealistic. Can we agree that a lot of the transformation in society begins in an extremely idealistic way? And then people work their way into transforming what is idealistic into what is achievable and practical. and that thinking idealistically is actually important to the agenda that we want to put on the table for transformation. Because if we are not going to be idealistic about many of these things, the easiest option is to give up. So idealism is central to this. Excessive idealism might be disruptive of what you want to achieve. There are already frameworks that have been proposed. There are critiques that are happening. I think the central challenge around transforming the continent through education has been that we have forgotten to deal with the more basic aspect of how do you resource the process towards achieving transformation and decoloniality. And so I am not one of those to be scared of the importance of idealism. I think idealism has its role, and thinking through how you move from idealism to what is achievable is a pathway that you want to follow. Emily Diouf, thank you very much for posting the link to Tade Aina's article, so I don't have to go back to that. Your question around the nature of the relationship between school, university, and community, I think is very important. A few years ago, out of a process of trying to secure funding from one of our partners in Codestria, we were given a link to the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. So we, in an attempt to exploit that link, we asked him to be a champion, both for Codestria, but also for education. When we did this, our interest was to just ask African governments to just keep 1% or less of their resources to facilitate an intervention in education, but also an intervention that facilitates a link with the community. Unfortunately, he passed on and that project never went on in a way. But in the council, we have had the pleasure of having to support academics who are thinking about relationships between community and the university. And in recent times, we have published some of these works. And yes, I agree with the point about decoloniality and being able to understand what decoloniality is, what it means, and all that. And actually, if you look at the literature, the reference point has been initial work done in Latin America, but also initial work done in the 1960s, 1970s. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, which I had intended to speak about, but I was a little too conscious of time, Moving the Center, Decolonizing the Mind, have been useful in framing the question about how you move into a system of emancipatory politics that allows actual decoloniality to happen. And I think that there is sufficient work already being done. In my own lecture, I was actually making a reference to Boan de Souza Santos' book on epistemologies of the South, which I think is also a useful intervention from somebody who is radically informed about the necessity of changing education epistemology, but also of changing the legal basis around which some of these things that we are talking about are done. I have been given a warning to stop in a few minutes, so I'm unlikely to answer all the questions, but I hope that this sheds light on a few of the things that you've raised. Thank you very much, Chair.
Comprehensively. And I do want to just recognize Dr. Murunga, that our provost of the university felt that this was such an important event that he has joined us, and I wanted to recognize him in the room. And if we could put a camera on him, Provost Joe Berger, we're doing this for the first time, a high flex event. Dr. Murunga is joining us from Dakar, Senegal. He is the executive director of Africa's foremost research organization and institution called Codestria, the Council of Development of Social Science Research in Africa, the foremost continental research institution. And Dr. Murunga himself is a an erstwhile lustrous scholar, and has just given us and finished a lecture on decolonizing African education and how that will transform the continent. I should tell you, Dr. Murunga, that before Dr. Joe Berger, who was our provost now, became the provost, he was also the dean of our College of Education. So I'm suspecting that he's here because he saw education in the title and is very much interested in educational issues wherever they are. And I think actually that Dr. Berger spent quite some time in Malawi, there in Malawi, in Southern Africa, working on educational issues. Or were you in the Peace Corps?
One, I'm very sorry to be disruptive. I had hoped to get here a little earlier, but fate intervened. But when I wanted to just say that I thought it was really important to be here and I was interested in hearing about the topic, but I also think the Africa Scholars Forum is a very important and integral part of what we do here at UMass Boston. And I actually worked with the University of Malawi for several years to help develop the first 2 master's programs in education in Malawi, one in educational leadership, one in educational assessment, and have maintained a relationship with them ever since. I've done some work up in Somalia and Ethiopia as well on education development projects. But I'm sorry that I missed the bulk of your talk, but I did want to have a chance to come by and just catch what I can. And thank you for spending your time with us. And thank you to all of you for your interest and dedication to really thinking about our connections with Africa, how we can apply our skills, our expertise, and our passions to improving education. And we can't improve education anywhere, Africa, in the US, without decolonizing education. So we have a lot to learn from each other. And so I really appreciate opportunities like this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Provost. Thank you, Provost Berger. Okay, we are, running out of time. I know we did have one question in the chat that we could mention, but I don't think we really have time to answer it because we do have to transition into our business meeting, and Dr. Murunga has accepted to join us. And there's a lot of food here, in the in-person room. We promised the reception, and we do want you guys to eat it. So we're going to go into a small little interlude for about 3 or 4 minutes while people collect their food, and then we transition into the business meeting, where Dr. Murunga will begin with talking about possible collaborations between the University of Massachusetts, Boston, through the McCormick Scholar School of Policy and Global Studies and the Africa Scholars Forum and Codestria. So thank you, Dr. Murunga, for staying with us. We would invite you to eat some of our food, but but I'm sure that in Dakar there you have jollof rice, right? And chapati. And glorious. And for those of you out there in Zoom world, you can stay with us and join us for our business meeting if you're signed up. But just give us about a 5-minute break while we put on some music and collect our food here, and then we'll move into the business meeting section of the program. So let's thank Dr. Murunga again for what an excellent keynote.
Thank you.